Welcome everybody. It's my pleasure to introduce again an obviously very popular speaker at the Free Market Foundation, a regular visitor, a good friend, one of South Africa's leading commentators on economics, and also I think a reasonably formidable political analyst. And Dawie Roodt, you know, the old cliche doesn't need an introduction. He does, he deserves one. He's a Blue Bulls supporter and they beat the Hurricanes, which is what makes him quite cheerful. So otherwise we would have had a very depressing presentation, but I can tell you it's now going to be at a higher level. Dawie is the Director and Chief Economist of the Efficient Group, which is an outstanding company, I might say, and specializes it does portfolio management. Dawie specializes in that. His speciality in the area of economics is monetary and fiscal policy. Obviously the budget falls then squarely within his domain. And he is one of the most referenced economists in South Africa in the media, quite conceivably the most referenced. Is there anyone else more commonly referenced than him? And even if there is, he outdoes them anyway, because for 12 years he's been doing the anchor presentation of the very popular Afrikaans TV program Ontbytsake. So even if anyone else gets into the other media more than him, he knocks them out by being on that every morning. So with that, we have Dawie to talk about this budget. For me, it is interesting. I feel as if South Africa is someone that has just burst a bubble or burst a boil or pulled a tooth. And that is to say there's a great sense of relief that you've burst the boil, but now you have to deal with the residue that comes out of it. And it seems to me as if everyone is so relieved at bursting the boil, which is the end of the Guptas and Zuma perhaps, there's a kind of ramaphoria that has gripped the country, and everyone is in some kind of ecstatic state, not because of particularly what's in it or what it implies, it seems to me, because I can't tell that there's all that much difference, but because of what people think has been moved on from. And there's some interesting tales I could tell about how people in the media are handling this, but I'll whisper them to you afterwards if you ask me. So with that, over to Dawie to come and tell us about the past, the present, and the future. And he's always going to be entertaining and controversial, so brace yourself, fasten your seatbelts. If you can't handle controversy and jibes, and if you can't handle something being said that offends you, then please leave before. If you can, then hold in there, fasten your belts, and here's Dawie.
Okay. Dankie Leon, thank you. I don't know, for some weird reason, I'm always nervous when at the Free Market Foundation. The most difficult part when I prepare a presentation like this is to... Hoe's dit? Bietjie beter? Ek dink hy werk nie. I must switch it on. We're not using this. Okay, let me just try to speak a little bit louder. Is that okay? Cool? All right. The most difficult part doing a presentation like this, the most difficult part of writing for me is getting that heading right. I need something to hang my coat on. So I can't write a story unless I've got this heading right.
Switch that off because you're getting a...
Oh, is that? So what must I do? Okay, cool. So getting the heading right. The same with a presentation like this is that, but with a presentation it's slightly different. With a presentation I got to get the picture right. So let me share this picture with you. So isn't that nice? So that's the picture. Okay, I've got a presentation on the budget. Thank you very much, Leon, and the FMF for asking me to do this presentation here tonight again. And I've got a presentation on the budget, and as always, I'm going to start with what's going on globally. Just a few comments on the global environment, what's going on internationally, and just a few things that I think are important. It seems that we may, at long last, see some inflationary pressures internationally. The unemployment levels in the United States are very, very low, and there are signs that we can see that there are some wage pressures building up in the United States. And we can also see recently the increase in commodity prices, and that may spill over in some inflationary pressures internationally. So I think from a purely financial market point of view, this is probably the main theme internationally. Some inflationary pressures seems to be becoming more important. That means that central banks are likely to continue to tighten monetary policy. Just remember, the past 10 years, or actually it's a bit longer than the past 10 years, we've seen a huge increase in debt, debt levels internationally. That's debt levels of corporates, of companies, of governments, of states, and of individuals. We've seen a huge increase in debt levels. And if there's an increase in interest rates, for example, in a high debt environment, that leads to all sort of very painful things. We have already seen some short-term interest rates going up. In the United States, we've seen a number of increases, and the new governor, or the new, what's his name, chairman of the Fed in the United States, seems to be suggesting that there could be a little bit more than only 3 interest rates increases in the US. Also get used to a new word. It's called quantitative tightening. Recently, central banks have been printing a lot of money, pushing this money into the system. The opposite is likely to happen. Now, that is important because monetary policy will tighten through 2 avenues. The one is short-term interest rates will be going up, and the other one is liquidity will be withdrawn from the financial markets. And in the process, what is happening? Long-term interest rates are still relatively low, and short-term interest rates are going up. Now, that is usually a sign of a pending recession, of a recession that can be expected. And it makes complete sense, but I'm not going to go into much of that. But essentially what is happening, short-term interest rates are going up, long-term rates are relatively low, and the moment that goes into inverse, the moment long-term interest rates dip below short-term interest rates, then that is usually a sign of a possible recession on the horizon. So from a financial market point of view, I think central banks overdoing monetary policy tightening may be the biggest potential threat internationally. In the meantime, markets are just running like there's no tomorrow. And yeah, I mentioned so that watch out for monetary policy. Central banks get it wrong quite often. Central banks like to portray this image of a bunch of people that know everything. They don't. They're just normal people, and they get it wrong quite often. Okay, just a few comments about the state of the nation, and of course the context in which this budget was delivered. I think it's still pretty much a Zuma's budget. There simply was not time. You can see the fingerprints of our new president in a budget here and there, but the numbers are pretty much Zuma numbers because it takes a long time to prepare something like this. It's a continuous process, and the budget, remember, is a 3-year rolling budget. So I think pretty much a Zuma budget. It was also presented by a Zuma minister, Gigaba, pretty much a Zuma minister. So I don't think there was time to really make changes to the budget. I suspect we're going to see a couple of changes in the way state finances are managed during this year, and of course the next budget will be, or maybe even a medium-term budget in October, will be closer to whatever the new president is going to do. I'm not going to go through everything, maybe just 1 or 2 things that I want to comment on. The president did mention infrastructural investment in the state of the nation, and in fact, if you look at the budget, that is exactly the only place where they actually cut spending on infrastructural investments. And land expropriation without compensation, there is another word for it, it's just called theft. And believe me, it's not going to end with land, and it is not even about land, and it's not about redistribution. What it is about the centralization of power and the centralization of ownership, if you like, in the hands of politicians. That's all it is. It's not going to be redistributed. There are a number of contradictions in the speech of the president. One is that we want to create millions of jobs and all sort of things, and at the same time, we want to introduce a minimum wage. I mean, that's a contradiction. I can't understand how that works. The national health insurance, of course, that's something I'm quite concerned about, because the biggest problem in South Africa is not free higher education or not. It's the biggest problem, if you talk about education, certainly is actually primary education. In the NHI, I'll touch on that a little bit later. Something that I do think that the President is going to do something about, and in fact he's already started doing that, and that's the way that the state-owned enterprises are run, which is good, I would say. But we need much more information on state-owned enterprises. Okay, let me get going. But I just want to touch on a little bit more politics. Remember that the ANC has got two political allies. The one is COSATU, but COSATU is not the same animal as COSATU 10 years ago. COSATU today is essentially, represents the civil service. The majority of COSATU members are civil servants today. So don't think COSATU represents the worker. The worker is represented by some other trade unions to the left of COSATU. And they've become more irrelevant recently. The South African Communist Party certainly become much less influential than in the past, but the ideas are still within the fabric of the ANC. In fact, the President even quoted Karl Marx from everyone what he can afford and to everyone what he needs. What the President needs to do, and if I can criticize the President on one thing, I believe that sometimes a good political leader needs to be a little bit ruthless sometimes. I haven't seen that in a president yet. I mean, a good example is the change in the cabinet, the shuffle in cabinet just now. He was late. He said he's never going to be late. He was late because obviously there was some political deal making behind the scenes. So, and I do not see that ruthlessness in the president yet. State-owned enterprises, I mentioned that. And yeah, maybe just a general comment about South Africa's business plan. How do we run this economy? What is our business plan? What's our plan in South Africa? And our plan is a plan of trying to spend ourselves rich. We are very good at spending. We are very good at borrowing money. And we are very good at taking money away from productive people and give it to unproductive people, essentially. What we should be doing what other successful countries have done to become wealthy, and that is that you need to save, you need to invest, and you need to create wealth. That is what it means to become wealthy, to create more wealth. And we're certainly not doing that. I'll come back to that a little bit later. So let's compare South Africa on a few things. First of all, on GDP growth. This is economic growth. South Africa is the green one over there. And as you can see, compared, for example, to the emerging world, the red one over there, South Africa's GDP growth has been lagging that of most countries in the world. The blue one over here, that's the world's average, and that's the rich world over there. But they do not need to invest because they've got a lot of capital stock already. So clearly South Africa, compared to, for example, our peers, the emerging economies, are simply not growing fast enough. If you could look at South Africa, our per capita GDP compared to the rest, that's the rich world. This is the world, and this is South Africa, the green one, compared to the emerging economies. Now you can't really see it there, but if you zoom in a little bit, you can see what is happening is that the emerging economies is catching up with South Africa quite rapidly, and within the current trend, within approximately 10 years, South Africa's per capita GDP will be the same as that of the emerging world. And thereafter, the emerging world will overtake South Africa on a per capita GDP basis. Okay, this is fixed investment. Why is all of this happening? Simply because we are not investing. Our investments levels, as you can see, is well below that of the major emerging economies in the world, like, for example, the Chinese and the Indians and so. We're just not investing enough in South Africa. And how do you measure success? One way of measuring success is looking at life expectancy. Life expectancy in the rich world close to about 80 odd years or so. That is the world's average, about 70 odd years or so. And that is the emerging world. The emerging world, their life expectancy already is higher than that of South Africa. One thing that Zuma did right is to get rid of the silly AIDS policies of Mbeki, leading to a significant increase of life expectancy in South Africa, but it's still well below that of the rich world. This is our unemployment levels. Close to 30% of South Africa workers are unemployed, And if you look at the expanded definition of unemployment, unemployment levels are actually closer to 40% or so. Okay, just a few comments about the South African Reserve Bank. What we've seen recently is the rand strengthening quite nicely. That, of course, is putting downward pressure on inflation, and that may create a window of opportunity for the South African Reserve Bank to cut interest rates. But only a relatively small window of opportunity, because internationally interest rates are going up, and the South African Reserve Bank can't go in one direction while the rest of the world is moving in another direction. So eventually we will need to follow the international trends as well. So in the short term there is a possibility of a rate cut. But with the recent shenanigans, and I saw the rand coming under some pressure this afternoon, but maybe a 25 basis points, maybe a 50 basis points cut, but that window of opportunity will probably close by around about the middle of the year or maybe a few months later. So there is a possibility of a rate cut, but whatever the Reserve Bank decides to do, it's not going to do much. I think that is what's important. Now, this is a calculation on the exchange rate of the currency. What I've done, this is a straightforward purchasing power parity approach. And what I've done, I've calculated the rand's under or overvaluation. Up means the rand is weak, down means the rand is getting stronger. And based on this specific calculation, it's like the Big Mac index, like just a little bit more sophisticated. The rand on average since 1980 was approximately 50% on average undervalued compared to the US dollar. Quite interesting, and I don't really know why that is so, but during the Zuma period, the rand actually was a little bit stronger than its average since 1980. But all that is not really important. The important part is that currently, in fact, the rand has come down a little bit further. Currently, the rand is stronger in relative terms than where it has been for quite some time. So if you want to take some money out of South Africa to invest in your portfolio abroad, then maybe now is not a bad time. That's just on the Reserve Bank. This is our unemployment levels. We've got very high levels of unemployment because of weak economic growth, labor legislation, labor relations, and very importantly, skills. And I'll get to that also a little bit later. This is economic growth, and you can quite clearly see where the Z period started over there. And this is my expectations for economic growth over the next few years or so. Less than 2%, which is horrible, which is absolutely horrible, in an environment where the population is growing at close to 2%. This is our current account deficit. People don't really understand what it means, but a current account deficit means a couple of things. It means that you import more than what you export. That's easy to understand, but it also means that you consume more than what you produce. And it also means that you don't have enough savings to pay for your investments, and that means that you are dependent on foreign savings flowing into South Africa. And our investments are actually quite low. So the current account deficit is what I said earlier, is just a symptom of the way that we run South Africa. We're good at spending, but we're not good at making stuff. And that's what the current account deficit essentially tells us. Now I'm comparing my numbers to that of the Minister of Finance, and I'm just going to pick on one or two numbers. My expectations for economic growth this year is about 1.6%. Slightly better than the Minister of Finance is 1.5%. Fiscal deficit, the difference between revenue and expense, is 4.2% relative to the GDP or relative to the size of the economy. The Minister of Finance slightly better. Current account deficits, and that's an important one. My debt to GDP numbers the end of this or the coming financial year is expected to be around about 56% or so, while the Minister of Finance is budgeting for a debt to GDP ratio of approximately 55%. I'll get back to that also. A couple of special announcements by the Minister of Finance. No real foreign exchange regulations or a relaxation of foreign exchange regulations. The Post Bank is going to get a banking license, so prepare for another state-owned enterprise that needs to be bailed out. The Minister of Finance says that we need more regulation on so-called cryptocurrencies and fintech. Well, that's the whole idea. The reason why we have this new fintech or cryptocurrencies is because they cannot control us. So I've got a surprise for them. In fact, I'm a member of a committee that's supposed to advise the Financial Services Board, the Minister of Finance, and the Reserve Bank on what to do on the regulations regarding so-called private currencies or cryptocurrencies. And my advice to them is, well, work with them. Don't try to oppose it, because you can't. And I'm very, very excited about the future of the blockchain, because it will give the power to where it's supposed to be, and that's in the hands of the individual. The Minister of Finance is very worried about a downgrade, rightfully so, I would say. Okay, now this is one of the most important graphs I'm going to show you this evening. I've got three very important ones. This is one of them. There are two important lines here, and only looking at this graph, you can see something happened. I mean, this graph is just not a straightforward graph. Something happened. So clearly something happened there. I mean, you can see something happened over there. There are two lines. There's a red line. The red line is state spending as a percentage of GDP, percentage of the economy. The blue line is state revenue, or tax collections mostly, as a percentage of GDP of the Minister of Finance. Now, the theory tells us, well, that is the theory of John Maynard Keynes. If your economy slows down, then it's okay for the state to increase spending to try to support an economy that slows down. But as soon as the economy starts growing, you're supposed to start spending less to pay back all this debt that you have accumulated during this period of extra spending. Now, this is what our politicians indeed did. The economy slowed it down, and what they did, they started spending more money. But the problem is, when the economy starts growing, they spend even more. So they didn't reverse this increase in state spending. This state spending was primarily on people in one way or the other. Like, for example, we have a huge army of civil servants working for us in South Africa, and they are very well remunerated. And we have all sort of other things that we need to spend money on as well. So we saw this huge increase in state spending, mostly on people. And if you spend money on people, then all sort of funny things happen. One thing that happened if you overpay civil servants and you spend more on civil servants, they also pay personal income tax. Now, what happened on the revenue side of the fiscus, the revenue, tax collections over here, that huge collapse in state revenue was primarily because of corporate taxes, company taxes coming under a lot of pressure because of the financial recession, or the recession then. And the best tax to tell you, or tax collections, to tell you what is going on in the underlying economy is actually company taxes. So company tax collections came under a lot of pressure because the economy was slowing down. But soon afterwards, some other taxes started to perform quite well. Which taxes were those? And that is the spending on additional, on people, on civil servants, for example. Because if you increase spending on civil servants, they also pay personal income tax, and the Minister of Finance, of course, collects that personal income tax, and in a way the Minister of Finance paid his own personal income tax increase from around about there. That's not all. If you pay a civil servant a lot of money, then they buy a lot of Kentucky. And if you buy Kentucky, you pay value-added tax. So value-added tax collections of the Minister of Finance also increased during that period. But corporate tax collections remained under pressure. There's a third factor that's very important. If you employ a civil servant and you give them a salary slip, a salary proof of his salary, he will go to a bank and he will borrow money to buy a Beamer and to buy a house. And of course you pay VAT and all sort of things on that as well. But what has happened recently is that the debt levels of civil servants has reached certain levels that banks do not want to lend more money to civil servants. And in fact, what we've seen recently is that personal income tax collections have been slowing down a little bit, and value-add collections have also been slowing down a little bit. So that's what we have. We've had a huge increase in state spending, and this is the budget of the Minister of Finance. He's planning for even more increase in state spending over the next couple of years. And this is the single biggest problem with the budget of the Minister of Finance. They are simply spending too much money. That's it. The state is just too big. And this is the revenue. And of course, there's a third important factor, and there's a gap between how much they spend and what they get in, and this gap is called the fiscal deficit, or how much the Minister of Finance is going to borrow. Okay, that's a very important graph. Now, let's see where they get all this money from. Nearly 40% of total state revenue comes from this one, and this is personal income tax. So personal income tax, nearly 40%, 38%, is from personal income taxes. The second most important revenue source for the Minister of Finance, the red one over here, and that is a value-added tax, an indirect tax, followed by company taxes, corporate income tax, and some other taxes over there, some smaller taxes over there. So these are our three major sources of revenue for the Minister of Finance. Maybe I can just make a comment there. That green one over there, that's approximately 50 billion rand. That it transfers to the South African Customs or Southern African Customs Union. So the South Africa collects, whenever you import something into the Customs Union, South Africa will collect the taxes on those imports, and South Africa will transfer, based on a certain formula, the money to Lesotho or Swaziland or Namibia, whatever the case may be. In the case of Lesotho, I haven't updated these numbers recently, but I can remember I did it about 3 or 4 years ago or so. In the case of Lesotho, South Africa's contribution to Lesotho's budget is approximately 90% of total revenue for the Lesotho government. Okay, so 50 billion rand is transferred to the other members of the Customs Union. Okay, now I'm not going to go through all that. Suffice to say, I've made some calculations and estimates, and the point I want to make with this specific slide is that chances are quite good that the Minister of Finance's revenue in the coming financial year will again be under some pressure. This is just the value-added tax, VAT, or rather the increase in the petrol price. The petrol price, or the increase in the petrol price, or the so-called fuel levy, is an indirect tax, which is, there's no such thing as a good tax, but it's one of the less bad taxes. I looked at the three major taxes again. You can quite clearly see that the contribution of personal income taxes to the total tax take of the Minister of Finance just kept on increasing since 2006 to 2007, in fact even before that. So this is the total contribution of personal income taxes. Value-added taxes has remained relatively flat, and corporate income taxes, company taxes, have been falling the last couple of years. And that is a much better indication of underlying economic activities. So if corporate taxes come under pressure, you must know your economy is not doing well. How do we compare to the rest of the world? Not well. South Africa's marginal income tax rate at 45% is high, and there are only a few countries in the world with higher marginal personal income tax rates, like for example Japan, Austria, and France, and so on. Theoretically, an emerging economy like South Africa should have relatively low direct taxes and higher indirect taxes. So South Africa, looking at South Africa's personal income taxes, is trying to act like a rich country, like for example Japan, or like France, for example. Our personal income tax rates are very high, and not only are they very high, you also get into that marginal category at a relatively low income level. Okay, let me just show you what I mean by that. There are 55-60 million people in South Africa. 109 individuals, 109,000 individuals, 110,000 individuals in South Africa. That's that little yellow part on top there. 110,000 individuals pay a quarter of total personal income taxes. Less than 2 million individuals, 1.7 million individuals pay 81% of total personal income tax. And income tax is by far the most important revenue source for the Minister of Finance. Corporate taxes. Now, there's a funny guy with funny hair in the United States. It's the president, and he decided to cut corporate taxes from 35% to 21%. This is what happened to corporate taxes in the United States. This is where South Africa is, and again, pretty much the same as that with personal income taxes. An emerging economy is supposed to be much reliant on corporate taxes and more reliant on indirect taxes, like for example value-added tax. So South Africa's corporate income taxes are also relatively high. But more importantly, look at this. Now this number is not a typo. 234 companies in South Africa. 234 companies in South Africa pay 46% of total personal income taxes. So that's 233 plus the efficient group out there. So pay 43% of total company taxes. 25,000 companies in South Africa pay 95% of total corporate taxes in South Africa. Now I want to make a statement, and that is that companies don't pay taxes in South Africa. With the exception of a few, most companies do not pay tax in South Africa. And if you really want to do something to support small business, please stop giving them loans. Please stop doing all these summits and conferences and things about small businesses. Just get rid of small companies paying taxes totally. Or replace it with something like, for example, a turnover tax. Tell a company, any company with a turnover below 100 million, as an example, you pay 1% turnover tax and that's it. You don't have to hand in your financial statements. We don't need auditors to look after whatever, your depreciations or whatever. Whatever your turnover is, 1%, pay over to the Minister of Finance and that's it. Simplify it. And that's the way to support small companies in South Africa. Not by doing more, but in fact doing less. And remove all these obstacles. And one of those obstacles certainly is a tax system that is totally far too complicated for a developing country like South Africa. This is our VAT levels. India recently increased VAT by 3%, 3 percentage points, which, well, we could have done exactly the same. Now, there is no such thing as a good tax, but if you have to choose a tax to increase, VAT certainly is a better tax to increase than, for example, corporate income taxes. And just something else about corporate taxes, corporates never ever pay taxes. Corporates will always shift their total tax burden down to individuals in a form of either an increase in the prices of their goods and services, so their clients pay that tax, or they will pay their workers less, so the workers will pay, or they will pay smaller dividends to their shareholders. And companies never pay tax. We can just as well get rid of company taxes. In fact, all taxes are always paid by individuals in the end. So company tax or value-added tax, if you want to increase something, if you have to increase something, an increase in VAT is the least bad thing, one of the less bad things to do. And I think what the DA is doing now is just populist. It's easy to try to get some support. A responsible opposition party will actually march in the streets and say that the state needs to spend less. The state needs to employ fewer civil servants. But if you do that, you're not going to get that many votes. You're probably going to lose a couple. So I think Muzi is simply being populist. This is an opportunity for him, and I think people actually do see right through this attempt by the DA. A couple of other announcements. The Road Accident Fund is bankrupt. It will be replaced by something else. We don't know yet what, but there's something else that will replace the Road Accident Fund. And that, whatever it is, will be given 35 billion rands worth of additional guarantees. 35 billion rand. That was not in the speech of the Minister of Finance, was it? There was a huge increase in personal income taxes by stealth. Remember, inflation, eventually if you get a salary increase to accommodate inflation, for example, you may end up in a higher income bracket, and in order to neutralize the effect of inflation, the Minister of Finance is supposed to adjust these brackets, at least with the inflation rate. Now, one example, if your salary is about R1 million or so annually, then the Minister of Finance should have given you a tax relief, a personal income tax relief of 25,000 rand for the year. He did not. He gave you 2,000 rand. So in actual fact, you've seen an increase of 23,000 rand extra personal income tax in the 1 million income category. So this is one way of increasing taxes without anybody actually knowing about that, because you move into next income tax brackets. They're going to keep on with Sunroll. Good luck. A VAT increase by 1%. Like I've said, there's no such thing as a good tax. VAT increase is not a good idea. But if you have to increase something, it's better to increase VAT. But I would have liked to see a reduction in some other taxes, like corporate taxes, as an example. Estate duties increase quite a lot. Fuel levy increase, sin taxes, so-called sin taxes, and then special economic zones. There will be a couple of new special economic zones where a special and a lower corporate income tax will be applicable. My advice to the Minister of Finance is rather make the whole of South Africa a special economic zone. And then a carbon tax will be introduced from the 1st of January 2019. I said there's a coming tax revolt. I think we've already seen signs of that. There's something called tax. What's it called? Where you can measure the flexibility of tax. You can measure the way. What's the word for it? Buoyancy. That's the word I'm looking for. Tax buoyancy. And quite clearly, tax buoyancy in South Africa is much less than where it was some time ago, and that's usually a sign of tax morality, that people have stopped paying taxes. And the problem is, and I don't know if this is legal to do this. I don't know if that is included in free speech. Am I allowed to encourage people not to pay taxes? What is the stronger right? The right to free speech, or am I allowed? Does that include encouraging people not to pay taxes? I'm not doing that. Just by the way. Okay, so there's some revenues. Okay, where's your money going to? The bulk of your money, and this is not state spending. Listen to the words of politicians. They talk about government revenue and government spending. This is not government spending. It's not government revenue. It is state revenue. It belongs to the state. It doesn't belong to the government. Governments are the guys that run the state on our behalf. And when they go, they're not going to take the debt. They're going to leave the debt, as an example. So state spending, where is the money going to? The bulk of that goes to education. Now, I am quite passionate about education. And I think what we need to do, we have to spend much less on education. And certainly this idea of so-called free higher education is really a silly idea. Because where we really need better quality education is exactly there. And it's not money that's the problem. We spend more on education than most countries in the world, in absolute terms and in relative terms. And I'm going to show you something just now. Then a couple of other important expense items. Social assistance, that's on the different grants mostly. And then this one, this is the one that's going to come back and bite us. And that's interest on state debt. Remember, interest on state debt always lags a little bit. If state debt goes up, you will see a smallish increase in interest, and it will go up, and state debt will go up a little. And about 3 or 4 years after a sharp increase in state debt, only then will you see a significant increase in interest on state debt. So there's quite a significant lag of a couple of years. Exactly the same, if you can reduce your state debt levels, your interest payment will remain relatively high, and only after if you reduce your debt levels for a couple of years will interest components start coming down. So we are at the beginning of the phase where interest on state debt will start going up very sharply over the next couple of years. And that's the fastest growing of all the major items. That's the fastest growing expense item on the budget of the Minister of Finance. And a couple of other things over there. Okay, this is another important graph. Okay, this is state spending as a percentage of GDP. Now, roughly speaking, this is Trevor Manuel. He reduced state spending. And this is Pravin Gordhan. He increased state spending. Now, I don't know, for some weird reason, Pravin Gordhan is seen by the financial market as our savior. But the reality is, things started going horribly wrong while he was the Minister of Finance. It's not only his fault, of course. He had a president, and he had his colleagues, and there was the financial crisis, and commodity prices coming down and all that. But the reality is things started going wrong when he was the Minister of Finance. Then we had Nhlanhla Nene, and if you look at Nhlanhla Nene, state spending actually came down. And I must tell you, I'm very happy with Nhlanhla Nene as our new Minister of Finance. He's a quiet guy, he's a behind the scenes kind of guy, but he's a technocrat. He understands the numbers, and I'm full of hope that he's going to, I can't say much about the rest of the cabinet. I think Pravin Gordhan, by the way, in his new portfolio, is probably much better suited in his new portfolio than as the Minister of Finance. He's an outgoing guy, he's a good leader, people like to talk to him and so on. Well, in the Department of Finance, you need a real technocrat, and that is what Nhlanhla Nene indeed is. That's a guy that fell off the chair, by the way. All right, then we had the weekend special that wasn't there just for a little while. And then we had the smiling suit. Gigabyte, as the Minister of Finance, he was clearly completely out of his depth. And now we've got Nhlanhla Nene back. It was, I suspect it was between Nhlanhla Nene and Mcebisi Jonas, which would have been a very good choice as well. I like those two guys as the Minister of Finance. All right, so what are we doing in South Africa? We like to spend a lot of money, grants, cater deployment, those are the sort of things that we are very good at, to milk the state-owned enterprises or the parasitals. The state like to intervene in just about everything. And then all funny things, like for example, nuclear deals. What we need to do in South Africa is we need to create a world-class skills development program. I'm going to show you some numbers just now. We need strong economic, forget about job creation, that's a stupid idea. Please stop with this job creation nonsense. Grow the economy and jobs will happen. It's easy to create jobs. Politicians confuse jobs with keeping people busy. They like to keep people busy, but they're not very good at creating jobs. Only economic growth can create sustainable jobs. Privatization, I would like to see that. Better implementation of, well, and then we need an infrastructural drive. That is one of the responsibilities of the state, I believe, and that's the only place where we saw significant reductions in state spending. Now, I'm not going to go through all these numbers. Suffice to say, there are two very important studies. The one is the so-called Pearl study. The other one is the TIMS study. Go and check it up. The Pearl study is in TIMS study. And these two studies compare South Africa, the quality of South Africa's education standards on all sort of levels. Now, what I can tell you is that South Africa is not only doing bad, we are doing sometimes the worst in the world. Our primary education is just absolutely horrible. This is a national disaster. And before we get to free higher education and all that sort of nonsense, we have to fix primary education. And anyway, everybody's complaining about inequality in South Africa. Spending all this money on a few individuals that actually can make it to university, and very few of them actually pass, actually increases inequality. If inequality is a problem, then you have to lift up the whole population, everybody. And you start with primary education. This is a national disaster and a disgrace, the quality of South Africa's education. I'm just comparing interest on state debt. At the current rate, interest on state debt, in fact, will be the biggest expense item of the Minister of Finance pretty soon. That is how many people receiving grants in South Africa, 17.5 million, while we have just over 16 million people in South Africa with jobs. Now, this is my own calculations. I do not know how many people work for us in the state. I do not know, because I don't know what kind of definition to use. Because it can be either 1.3 million, that's what the Minister of Finance says, or it can be as many as more than 3 million civil servants working for us. Because it depends on where you cut off, what your definition is of civil servants. Like, for example, if you include national departments, the state-owned enterprises, the provinces, the local authorities, then we have more than 3 million civil servants working for us. So this definition, according to this definition, we have just less than 2.4 million people working for us. So, but the point is, it's not necessarily the level, but the trend that matters. And we've seen a huge increase in the number of civil servants working for us in this country. And the blue line is a comparison to the private sector in terms of salaries or wages. And the average civil servant today is paid nearly 40% more than a private sector equivalent. And civil servants should in fact be paid less than the private sector because they're taking less risk. So this is a major issue. I don't know we're going to get out of this one. And that's what the DA should be focusing on. We have too many civil servants working for us. Some other special announcements. The Davis Tax Commission this year, or last year, made a couple of recommendations. One recommendation was that we should or consider the introduction of a so-called wealth tax. A wealth tax is a pure capital tax. So whatever is on your balance sheet, X% of that must be paid over to the Minister of Finance. And the Minister did indicate that there will be draft legislation this year to give effect to some of the Davis Commission's recommendations. What it is, I don't know, but the wealth tax stands out for me. The NEL's guarantees were extended, a couple of those. Eskom, nobody picked this up either, and it wasn't mentioned in the speech. But Eskom's guarantees were extended for 3 extra years, and it was increased by 15 billion rand. Now, the interest component of Eskom per month is between 3 and 5 billion rand. The beginning of this year, they raided the Government Employment Pension Fund. They took 5 billion from the Government Employment Pension Fund in order to be able to pay interest. That was primarily what the money was used for. So the Minister of Finance said that he's going to, that we need to strengthen the balance sheet of Eskom, and we're going to do this in a fiscal neutral manner. What does it mean, fiscal neutral manner? If it's not it's a fiscal neutral manner simply means that whatever money you spend on Eskom is not included in your fiscal deficit and is also not added to your debt. That's fiscal neutral. So there are only 2 ways of doing that. One way is by selling something and take this money and give it to Eskom. So you move something from your income statement essentially to fix a problem in your income, or rather you move something from your balance sheet to fix something on your income statement. So sell something and take this money and give to Eskom. I can't think of anything that we can sell that will bring in significant amounts of money. I know the Minister of Finance did indicate that there's a lot of property that he wants to sell. I don't think this is going to, and in any way, it's going to take some time. The second way of doing this in a fiscal neutral manner is by taking somebody else's money and give it to Eskom. Now, one way of doing that is to convert existing debt of Eskom into so-called equity. And they've done it before. 2 years ago, the Minister of Finance converted 60 billion rands of Eskom debt into equity. So the state now owns more than 100% of Eskom. That's what they did. So one possibility of doing this is by simply converting, and by the way, the Government Employment Pension Fund is owned nearly 95 billion rand by Eskom. So one way of doing that is to convert this debt of the Government Employment Pension Fund into equity, which of course will put the government employees in a significantly worse position than in which they are currently. Okay, so I don't know what they're going to do with Eskom. There's just not enough information in the budget to know what they're going to do with Eskom. I've made a rough calculation, and Eskom probably needs tens of billions of rands extra this year. I don't know where they're going to get the money. They just got downgraded. I don't know if you've seen that. Municipalities own 17 billion rand mostly to Eskom and to the water boards, and that 85 billion rand in so-called cuts in state spending, the bulk of that is cuts on local authorities, spending on capital infrastructural projects on local authorities. So they're going to spend less on local authorities, and they're going to try to get more out of local authorities. It doesn't make sense. Good luck if you think you're going to get that 17 billion from the local authorities. Some good news, no nuclear, and then the national health insurance. The Minister of Finance reduced the amount of money that you can deduct for tax purposes if you contribute to medical funds. And the idea is that the national health insurance, essentially what it wants to achieve is to mix the private health sector with the public health sector. And eventually what will happen, we will have one health sector in South Africa. Now, if you have a bucket of manure and you put a teaspoon of ice cream in a bucket of manure, then you have a bucket of manure. If you have a bucket of ice cream and you put a teaspoon of manure in a bucket of ice cream, then you have a bucket of manure. And that's exactly what's going to happen to South Africa's health service. What I would like to see is instead of making the private health service or converting that into a public health service, why don't we convert the public health service into a private health service? And it can be done. It can be done. Like, for example, the Department of Health can be converted into a state-owned medical fund, as an example. Privatize the hospitals and let them claim. And everybody belongs to the state government pension medical fund, as an example. So, and you go to whatever hospital you want to go to and claim as a citizen from the Department of Health. Now, what happens today is that the Minister of Finance wants to take control of all of this, and he wants to be in charge of the hospitals. Let him pay. Let me all include everybody in a health service in South Africa. But let's rather get the private or the public people that are dependent on public health services. Why don't we allow them to make use of public or the private health service industry, which is so much more efficient than what we see currently in the public health services sector? What do you call it? Okay, just a couple of other numbers. I'm not going to go through all of that. That's some technical stuff if you want to talk about that. That's the fiscal deficit. Just a comment about the fiscal deficit. It's like, and that's relative to GDP. The fiscal deficit is likely to hover between, say, 3.5% and 4.5% or so for the next 3 or 4 years or so. Whenever your fiscal deficit relative to GDP is bigger than the growth in GDP, then your fiscus is expansionary. Now, if you're not confused, it's because you're not concentrating. Let me just say that again. If your economy is growing at 10%, but your fiscal deficit to GDP is at 5%, then it's fine. Because then debt relative to GDP actually comes down. But if your fiscal deficit is at 4% relative to GDP, but the economy is growing at 2%, then debt relative to GDP will go up. So it's all about economic growth. Economic growth in South Africa is around about 2% or so, if we're lucky. The fiscal deficit at least 4%, maybe 4.5% or so, which simply means that debt to GDP ratio will continue to go up. That's just straightforward numbers. Now this brings me then to this very important graph. This is one of those other very important graphs. And this is state debt as a percentage of GDP. And again, we've got a couple of people there, a lot of them, and so on. And this is, you can quite clearly see what's been happening to state debt the last couple of years. A huge increase in state debt. Look how long it took Trevor Manuel to bring that down. And so see how suddenly state debt started increasing over there. And I'm afraid the state debt levels currently around about 56% of GDP. But remember, the Minister of Finance is quite economical with the truth, because he does not include everything in the state debt numbers. Like, for example, the debt of the state-owned enterprises, which he guarantees, is not included in the state debt numbers. If you include, it's probably going to reach close to 60% in 3 years' time, state debt relative to GDP, and that's the minister's numbers. It might be even higher. But if you include the state-owned enterprises, then in 3 years' time, state debt as a percentage of GDP is going to be as high as 70% to GDP. Now, this is one of the important numbers that the rating agencies watch. In fact, this used to be the only real number that was important to the state-owned enterprises. How much do you owe? As simple as that. Recently, other things also became important, like, for example, political stability. Political stability means policy clarity, which we kind of have a little bit better than, say, a month ago. I'm not really sure, but maybe that's a little bit better. And then more importantly, actually, is economic growth. So we have very high levels of state debt. We might have a little bit more policy clarity. We will wait and see for that, but we still don't have economic growth. And I've got a suspicion we're going to see another downgrade. And if we do see another downgrade from Moody's, as an example, we will be junk bonds with long-term interest rates going up, the rand going weaker, and all sort of other things. What I also like to point out is that when a Minister of Finance talks about state debt, he takes gross state debt consisting of treasury bills, bonds, and some other short-term instruments. And he subtracts available cash balances from that to get a so-called net debt number. The Reserve Bank does not use that definition. The Reserve Bank looks at gross debt and that's it. Now, the reason why the Reserve Bank decides to look at gross debt only is because that is the definition that the IMF and the World Bank uses, but that's not the only reason. The other reason is that a lot of this cash that the Minister of Finance subtracts from the gross debt is not available to the Minister of Finance for spending, for different reasons. Now, at the South African Reserve Bank, there's something like about, if you add everything together, about 300-400 billion rand that technically belongs to the Minister of Finance. But this money is not accessible for various reasons. But the Minister of Finance likes to deduct some of this from his gross debt numbers. So he's just playing a little bit with the numbers. And by the way, this is the main reason why we saw the Public Protector with recommendations last year to change the constitution and so on. Because they wanted to get control of the South African Reserve Bank because that is where the money is. Okay. Right. So how do you survive this awful budget? Because I believe it's an awful budget. Something good in a budget is that we are asset managers. So I take people's money and I manage it for them. But I'm limited on how much money I can take out of South Africa. If I run a unit trust, for example, there are certain prudential limitations on how much money I'm allowed to take offshore. No, that has been increased, and I'm on the investment committee of all our investment committees in my company, and I can assure you that at our next investment committee meeting, we are going to increase the money that we're taking offshore for our clients. So I advise you to take money, especially with a rand that's relatively strong, to take that money out of South Africa. Then, of course, I will never advise people to break any laws, but I do advise you to make use of all possible legal ways of reducing your tax burden. Pay as little tax as is legal. Something that you can do, get a good auditor to help you with that. Convert your income, instead of getting paid as a person or an individual, rather get paid as a corporate, as a company, as an example, because companies are taxed at a lower rate. It's possible to do that. And very important, die poor. because there was a huge increase in the estate duty, but that's one of those so-called voluntary taxes. It is possible to manage your estate or your affairs in such a manner that you do not pay estate duties at all. So make sure you have a good financial advisor to assist you and to help you with that. Okay, now that's the budget. Maybe just one or two last comments. Now, we heard yesterday that they're going to steal assets from now on, the state, and it's not going to end with land only. That assets that they're going to steal is not going to go to other individuals. It's going to go to the state. The state is simply going to control more of our lives. They're going to try to do that. I see one or two positive developments in South Africa. Obviously, anything is better than Zuma. But let's just wait and see, because I haven't seen that ruthlessness yet in Cyril Ramaphosa. So I'm not sure if he's going to be a good president. I'm holding my breath and see what's going to happen. Internationally, there are some good things happening. The world economy seems to be growing, which will be good for South Africa. Commodity prices are going up. But I'm very concerned about South Africa generally speaking. I'm concerned because politics, as always, has become far more important. And I think this cabinet is very good, might be very good for the ANC, the new cabinet, but I'm not so sure it is good for South Africa. Thank you for listening to me. I'll take, if there are questions, I'll take.
No, I'll let you manage the questions.
Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir. At the back.
Department of Water and Sanitation. Your thoughts and views on where they stand and where we're going. Water being one of those critical infrastructural opportunities that we need to manage, we need to look at from a long-term point of view. And you talk about the infrastructural spend and the situation there. What would be your thinking in terms of the prospect of the department?
I don't really know, because I don't know that department that well. All I know is that the Minister of Finance, who was it, the previous one that was taken away now, did a horrible job apparently. And that is one of those things, obviously South Africa being a very dry country, which we need to manage much better. So, well, that's about what I can say about water. I'm not that well informed about water. I think you can just categorize it under infrastructure, And as we all know, it's not only water, but I go to the platteland quite a lot, and I can tell you the infrastructure of those small towns are disintegrating. It's horrible. There's one of these towns, I've forgotten the name, is that the road to the what do you call it, where you chuck the stuff away, wasn't maintained properly. So the people are simply, your refuse, you simply dump it next to the highway. And it's about 3 or 4 kilometers that you're driving through this. I mean, it's a disaster because they're not maintaining the road out to this dumping site, for example, and many other examples. I flew over Rustenburg a little while ago, and where the sewage works is, it's overflowing into the field, and it's just a disaster. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Dawie, on the graphs you showed of debt to GDP rising inexorably and probably starting to go almost exponential, how long before we go bankrupt and have to go to the IMF cap in hand?
That's a very interesting question, because I know R.W. Johnson 2 years or so ago, he wrote that book that South Africa is going to go to the IMF for an international loan. And I disagree with him. Because remember, and this is the mistake that I think he made, is that, and this is something good about South Africa, the total foreign loans of the state is it's less than 10% of total outstanding loans. Now what is that? Let me just do a quick calculation. The reserves at the South African Reserve Bank is approximately $60 billion. The total outstanding loans of the state is 10% of 2 trillion, it's about roughly about there. But that's total outstanding loans. So the short-term loans is less than the total reserves at the South African Reserve Bank. So if we go to the IMF and we borrow money, the only thing that the IMF will lend us is special drawing rights. Now, what are we going to do with special drawing rights? We can't use special drawing rights in South Africa because we use rands in South Africa. So it doesn't. The only reason why you would want to borrow money from the IMF is because you want to use this money to pay off some international commitment, and we have enough reserves at the South African Reserve Bank to pay off all those international commitments, at least in a relatively short, for the next couple of years. So that's not the issue. So I don't think we're going to go to the IMF. But yes, your question is still valid. When are we going to get in? When do you get to a point of no return? And I think we're pretty much there. I've done a rough calculation. In order to prevent state debt from completely getting out of hand, we need to cut back state spending by approximately 2% in real terms from next year onwards. Depending on economic growth, of course. If the economy starts growing at 4%, you don't need to do that. You can actually increase state spending. But if the economic growth remains at roughly 2% or so, then you have to cut state spending in real terms by about 2%. It doesn't sound much, but it's a lot. It's a lot. In nominal terms, that is probably 7-8% or so, which is a lot. And it's going to be extremely difficult to do. So I don't know how we're going to get out of this. And there's an additional issue, and that is not only your debt levels, it's also the interest, the cost of capital. And the cost of capital in South Africa, we pay approximately 8% for 10-year money in South Africa, compared to many the rich countries in the world. They pay 1% or less, or even below zero in some instances. There's only one country. Now, if you take debt and you multiply that with your 10-year, with your bond yield as an example, then you get a certain number. That gives you a proxy for your debt burden, if you like. So it's debt multiplied by the yields of, I use the 10-year bond yield. Now, South Africa, there's only one country in the world with higher debt. I'm not talking about wacko places like Venezuela, but there's only one country in the world with higher debt than South Africa, and that's India, based on this specific metrics. So although our debt is low, relatively low at below 60%, the debt of the Greeks or the debt of the Japanese is about 300%. The Americans are 130% or so, but they hardly pay any interest on that. So our relatively low debt is actually quite a heavy debt burden because of the high interest that we pay on that.
Dawie,
Yes,
would
sir.
you like to just expand on how an individual pays corporate tax rather than individual tax?
No, what you do, it's quite easy, sir. No, it's quite easy. What you do, instead of taking a salary, you start a company, and if you need to take out people on, there's an expense claim that you can put through the company as an example. Who knows what you're going to use the money for? So your company pays some expenses that you would have paid in your own name. But you have to do it very legally, of course. Of course, come on, you know what to do. Don't ask me that. Everybody knows what to do. Okay, anyway. Yes, Ian.
Dawie, you said you were withholding judgment on how Mr. Ramaphosa
Yes.
would like to do it. That you were holding your breath.
Yeah.
I don't know you can hold it long enough.
No. No, I must tell you, I'm a little bit, well, I'm waiting. Something that he did, first of all, I think he's a good speaker, he's a good orator, he can speak well, and everybody was so relieved when Zuma went, that everybody wants to, and of course everybody wants to see good things happening to South Africa. And what I'm a bit worried about journalists in South Africa is that this is not a good budget. And they all said these nice things about this budget. It's not a good budget, let's be honest about that. But he's a good orator. He did a good thing at Eskom. When he needed to change the board at Eskom, he did that. But now I'm waiting for the next thing. It's not coming. Yes, sir.
Yes, I just want to follow up on the question by Ian around your point that this was not a good budget. But the markets seem to have responded quite. They were not that negative to it. Why was that? Even in terms of the downgrades as well, it seems like it did avoid the downgrades from that perspective. Yeah. Why was that? Given that, even in my view, I do agree with it. It was an awful budget. Yeah. It wasn't that good. But why did the market?
Why did the market react positive to this? Well, I don't want to say that's a bit of a strong word. Yeah, but it was sort of neutral. Yeah. I think there are a couple of reasons why. The first one is that the South African rand is a very cheap currency. It's hugely undervalued. Despite the recent appreciation in the currency, it's still very, very weak. So whoever buys into South Africa, your entrance into South Africa is very cheap. So that's point number one. It's a really cheap entrance into South Africa. Secondly, you get an amazing yield of about 8%. Where can you get an 8% yield on a 10? So this is, you get cheap into an asset and you get an amazing return on this specific asset. The third one is this wave of optimism that we've seen in South Africa with Cyril Ramaphosa and so on, which I think is quite valid and so on. So I think there was just the financial markets were just taken up with this wave of positive news, and the fact is, like, for example, a currency that is still hugely undervalued and so on.
So a quick one, do you think we will get some downgrades this year?
Yes, I do think so. I think so. We've already seen Eskom being downgraded as an example. And if Eskom is downgraded, remember you've got the sovereign here, and Eskom is being downgraded even further. And that's likely to pull the sovereign down. So we're waiting only for Moody's now. If Moody's downgrade us to sub-investment, then we are junk bonds on our international bonds, which is going to be bad. Can I just get this one, sir? Yes, sir.
What concerned me most about the budget was the cut in infrastructure spending.
Yes.
Because if the state is to do anything positive, it's to actually build infrastructure. So they're cutting infrastructure and putting it into consumption, which is very worrying.
In fact, the total, remember, and that's another way of measuring the fiscal deficit. If you borrow a lot of money, even if you have low economic growth, if you've got an economic growth of, say, argument's sake, 1%, and you're borrowing 10% of GDP, but you use this money to spend on infrastructure, then it can be seen as a kind of investment, because in future, you're going to make use of the infrastructure, and the economy is going to grow in future. So as long as you spend the money on capital, then it's okay. And I've done the calculation. The total fiscal deficit in South Africa is approximately 200 billion rand. So that's how much money we're going to borrow. And of that 200 billion rand, we will spend approximately 150 billion rand on capital, which means we will borrow 50 billion rand that we're going to spend on current expenditure over the next X number of years. And our children will be paying back salaries of teachers that we spend for today in future. There's another way of looking at it. If you borrow money and you spend it on current expenditure, then you add to spending and you actually destroy capital and you add to the current account deficit. So the government is actually actively going to destroy. This is the plan. Actively going to destroy or convert savings or capital into consumption expenditure to the tune of about approximately 50 billion rand in the coming financial year. Yes. Yes, sir, at the back.
Doc, if you were the Minister of Finance, just in summary and big items only, what would you have done differently?
Well, you have to cut spending. You simply have to cut spending. I understand the politics, and I understand it's not possible to do. It's easy for me to say cut spending. But at least what I would have liked to see Minister of Finance is making a big thing of that. To stand up and say, listen, people, we can't afford it. We can't afford it. Please, we can't afford it. And he didn't do that. But if you want to be specific, there are a couple of things that I would do, and it's not that radical. It has been done, and I've mentioned this in this forum before. I will fire all civil servants, really. Not all at once, but, and reappoint them, but only based on merit. The second thing I will do, and of course you need to be not the Minister of Finance, you need to be a dictator to do that. The second thing it will do, I'll remove all obstacles in the way of job creation, all obstacles in the way of employing people, all obstacles. And the third thing that I would like to do is to create a world-class skills development system. Those are the three things that are important. Yes, sir.
Dawie, how do you justify stating that the rand is undervalued relative to the scenario that you've cast for the future?
Yeah. What I've done, you want to know how I did the calculations? You want to know how I calculated that?
Basically how you calculate, because the
Yes.
two appear to be
Okay.
diametrically opposed.
Yes. No. What I've done is basically the Big Mac index. The theory says that if you have two identical products in one country and another country, and ignore things like, for example, transport costs and all sort of other things. So this is just a theory. Then the price, if you buy a hamburger in South Africa, for example, that is exactly the same hamburger that you can find in the United States, but the South African hamburger is cheaper than in the US, then people will export hamburgers from South Africa to the US, prices will fall there and prices will come up here, and eventually you will have so-called purchasing power parity. If the prices are not exactly the same of similar products in two countries, then the only reason why that is the case is because one currency is undervalued relative to the other one. Now that's the theory. Of course, in practice, it doesn't always work like that. Now that's exactly what I've done. But instead of using the Big Mac index only, I've used a more extended basket, a more representative basket of goods. And I've compared the prices of goods in South Africa compared to that of the United States. And in South Africa, it's much cheaper to buy a basket of goods than in the United States. In fact, on average, it's about 50% cheaper to buy things in South Africa, a typical basket of things, compared to, say, for the United States, which then means that the South African currency is approximately 50% undervalued relative to that of the US dollar. That's all I've done. So it's not about the number, how far we undervalued, it's more about the trend, which is important.
If I just may,
Yeah, please.
I really see it as being the South African goods being sold at a discount to compensate for the disadvantages we have living in the country, rather than doing a direct comparison, because the scenario you've cast is that we are deep in it for the future.
You are absolutely right. So you can look at it differently. You can say it's a discount in a way, it's a premium that we're paying for being all these things in South Africa. You're absolutely correct. In fact, what the theory also says that in emerging economies, currency should be, say, between 10 and 15% undervalued compared to the rich world's currencies in any event. And the reason for that is because a developing economy is usually a country that needs a lot of infrastructural investment. So you need capital inflows. And in order to attract capital inflows, you need a relatively weaker currency. So it is exactly the same thing that you're saying, but you're just looking at it from the other side. It's the same coin, just the other side of exactly the same coin. But again, it's not about what the reasons are. I'm just trying to find some kind of trend. And the important thing about this specific graph about the undervaluation and overvaluation of the currency is that when the rand was trading at 14 rand, everybody says it's going to go to 20. And I was one of the very, very few economists that said, no, it's not going to happen, because it always turns back. And that's the value of this specific graph. When the currency shoots out completely to the ridiculously weak or strong level for that matter, then I look at this graph, and I try to look at this graph only and try to forget about the noise that's going on around me. Because the noise is everybody is happy about Ramaphosa, the rand's going to go to 11, then to 10, and then to 9, blah, blah, blah. And a good economist is somebody that can somehow look at the numbers and be convinced that your calculations are good. And I can tell you, the past couple of years, this specific graph as simple as it is, has served me quite well. That's my trade secret.
Now, time is roughly up, but, well, very few people seem to have left, but maybe another 2 questions.
Yeah.
You mentioned previously, well, first you said you would fire all the civil servants, and then also previously you mentioned, according to one of the graphs, that people in the private sector are getting paid so much less than an equivalent position.
Yes.
Is there any way, this is so obvious to me, to you, it's so obvious how much more they get paid than what they should, is it not? Is there any way that this can ever be normalized or just go back to normal?
No, I don't think so. And the reason why is because of the role of COSATU. And that was what COSATU did the last couple of years. They really demanded a huge increase in the civil servants, number of civil servants. They see this, that's part of the ideology of the Communist Party. They see this, and that's really part of communism. Karl Marx believed that if you get somebody that works for an hour, he produces an hour's worth of wealth. And it doesn't matter what you do, whether you sweep the streets or brain surgeon or whatever, 1 hour equals 1 hour. And that's exactly what they've done in the old Soviet Union. So that's a Communist Party's contribution, that's an ideological contribution, and the contribution of COSATU is that they will bring their amazing organization, because they used to be very well organized. We will bring this amazing organization of workers, and we will get them to vote for the ANC. But then what we want you to employ more civil servants, and we want you to pay them well. So that's just part of our political system. So the only way we can get rid of that is by getting rid of the ANC, to change the ruling political party. Or the alliance. Well, and I think the alliance is gradually falling apart anyway. It's not the same what it used to be. COSATU used to be the real representatives of the workers. They're not anymore, not at all. It's not a workers' organization anymore. It's a civil service. That's all it is. Yes, sir, at the back.
Going forward, what do you think is the finance minister going to look for more revenue sources?
Yeah. Well, I did mention we ran out of taxpayers. That is just the reality. And a couple of things that we can increase. We can increase VAT more to get more money. But that's going to be tough politically. You can see what's happening. We can increase, there are a couple of other things, like, for example, we can increase personal income tax, the major one. We can increase that, but the reality is that we're probably over that thing. There's something called a Laffer curve. We're probably over the bump of that Laffer curve. So I don't think you're going to get more money in there. And then that leaves you only with one thing, and that's capital, somehow. And like, for example, wealth taxes, estate duties, transfer duties, that sort of stuff. That's all. And then, of course, there's the final pot of gold, and that's the pension funds. And they've already started dipping into the pension funds, like the government employment pension fund, for instance. Okay. Thanks. Bye. Dankie. Dankie.
I don't think he's let us down. I think he's interested us, challenged us, analysed well, and Dawie's always this delightful mix of humour, wisdom, and simplifying complex ideas, for which thank you very much. Please stay around and socialise. If you do have questions you were too intimidated to ask in front of this impressive audience, and there are some significant people in it, then maybe you can catch Dawie afterwards. Thank you for your attendance, and thank you, Dawie. Thank you.